All right, we want to talk specifically about the experience of workers in the Gilded Age, the state of labor. Workers both benefited from and were victimized by the massive industrial growth that occurred during the Gilded Age. The standard of living rose. We've already talked about a few ways in which that happened. We'll talk a lot more about it when we get to urbanization. But there were also very difficult and dangerous working conditions, diminishing control, and a sense of powerlessness. All right, the workforce was largely composed of migrants and immigrants. I want to real quickly talk about a vocab pet peeve of mine. To migrate, which a migrant does, is to move within a country, like the Chinese peasants moving from the countryside to the city. To immigrate or be an immigrant is someone from a foreign country. To immigrate is to enter a new country. To immigrate with an E is to leave a country. You are immigrating to a foreign country. If I'm a Brit and I'm going to Australia, I am an immigrant with an E. When I arrive in Australia, I'm an immigrant with an I. Just a pet peeve of mine. All right. Both migrants and immigrants together comprised about 25 million people between 1865 and 1915. In the 1870s and 1880s, immigrants were mostly from Ireland, England, and Northern Europe, Northern and Western Europe, i.e. more Anglo-Saxon white people that we'd be more familiar with. By 1900, the source had shifted to Eastern and Southern Europe, people like Greeks, Italians, Croats, Slavs. In the West, immigrants were mostly from Mexico, and until the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, from Asia. There were economic pushes in their homelands, poverty, growing population, limited opportunity, and pulls in America, greater opportunity, more space, more jobs. But often their expectations were sometimes too high. Industries often lured workers with false promises. And the entry of immigrants heightened tensions within the working class. For example, the Eastern and Southern Europeans in the 1890s often displaced earlier immigrants. So you would have an Irishman formerly resented by an old stock American. Now he's resenting the Polish Jew or the Italian who's coming to take his job. This is a very famous picture, by the way. It was taken by Louis Hine, a famous photographer. It's very iconic. It's a family, a mother and 3 children arriving on Ellis Island from Italy in 1905. What can I say about wages and working conditions, except that in a nutshell, they were bad. Standards of living did rise, as I keep reminding you, because it seems like workers are having a bad time. But the standard of living was rising. But at about 1900, the average worker made between $400 and $500 annually, the average worker. But $600 was considered the minimum figure for reasonable comfort. So people struggled. The boom and bust cycles, wildly up and down economy also meant no job security. The first generation of industrial workers who were accustomed to agrarian life were jolted by the harsh and dispiriting effects of industrial discipline, scientific management, 10 to 12-hour days, 6 days a week, working conditions that were almost universally unsafe and unhealthy. Corporate efficiency heightened the distress over loss of control over work. And that, frankly, that loss of control, becoming a corporate automaton, as much as wages and working conditions, that loss of control produced worker militancy and violence. There were a lot of working women and children. The decreasing need for skilled labor, which subdivision of task and scientific management produced, resulted in allowed employers to hire lower wage women and children. They didn't have to pay them as much. Even married women were forced by low family wages to go out and work, even though there was a strong social aversion to it. And when women did work, they made about half of what men did. Not only were there more women, but also more children working in factories. And people did decry this. Public opinion led 38 states to pass child labor laws before 1900, but they had limited impact. Children were also regularly maimed and killed in industrial accidents. This very disturbing picture on the right, those are dead women who have leapt to their death from the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in New York in 1911. one of the worst disasters in New York history before 9/11. It was a big fire, and they were forced to leave. Over 100 people died, created a big scandal. Women mostly dominated the textile industry. But men died too. As late as 1907, 12 men died each week in the railroad industry. Now, labor tried to mimic the trusts by forming large organizations. Small craft unions had existed since before the Civil War, small textile workers' unions, for example. But now we tried to build large unions, large-scale national success. But by 1900, there really wasn't that much success. The National Labor Union was formed in 1866 by William Silvis. This was the first great national attempt at a union. It claimed 640,000 members, but it disintegrated after the Panic of 1873. By the way, it excluded women. So as big and broad as it had a lot of limitations. We'll talk later about the Panic of 1873 and the Panic of 1893, the two greatest busts of the Gilded Age. But the 1870s were tough. A long depression resulted from the panic, and it created unemployment, and the middle class was hostile to unions. When things turned violent, radicals and anarchists were blamed. Some parts of labor were militant and violent, but really small parts. But the whole of the labor movement was tainted with that brush. The Molly Maguires fostered this impression. They were a Pennsylvania coal miner organization within the ancient order of Hibernians. That's an Irish fraternity that exists still today. This was a subset of that. They were Irish coal miners, and they were violent. They sometimes used terror. They blew things up. They killed people. Many times, however, owners instigated violence to justify ruthless suppression. By the way, the guy in that picture, if he looks like Sean Connery, that's because he is. Sean Connery made a movie called The Molly Maguires about them. After 4 years of struggle and depression and desperation, the first great national labor clash occurred in 1877. It was called the Railroad Strike of 1877. It created a great hysteria. It began when Eastern railroads announced a 10% wage cut due to economic difficulties. Sometimes this would happen in the Gilded Age. It's hard to imagine today, but they would come to you and say, well, we're going to keep you employed, but we're going to reduce your salary. Railroad workers didn't like it. The strike resulted in severe service cuts. Equipment was destroyed. There were many riots, fires. It was bordering on class war. State militias and federal troops eventually brought things under control, but killed over 100 people. This great railroad strike was the first, but not the last, national-scale labor conflict. And the failed strike underscored just how desperate these workers were. Now, the first truly national effort at unionization was something called the Knights of Labor. It was founded in 1869 by Uriah S. Stevens, and it was a big tent. It included everybody, thinking that would be the way to union power. It was open to, quote, all who toiled, unquote, including even managers and women working in the home. It wanted to include everyone. There were only 4 kinds of people that were considered so despicable they weren't allowed in. Lawyers, bankers, liquor dealers, and professional gamblers. They were excluded. Now, the Knights of Labor had a very strong women's bureau. It was run by a woman named Leonora Barry, a social reformer in the Gilded Age. She was an Irish immigrant. And the Women's Bureau enlisted 50,000 women. Now, the Knights of Labor was loosely organized. The way it got so big was, it was kind of a decentralized power base. Goals included abolition of child labor, an 8-hour workday. But what they really wanted long term was reform of the economy with the workers in control. Something like a socialist vision. Now, by 1886, there were over 700,000 members under the leadership of Terence Powderly, who had succeeded Uriah Stevens. But this decentralized control was a problem. The Knights of Labor could not control their more militant members. Some strikes occurred that were crushed, discredited the organization, And the middle class, once again, decided didn't like organized labor. It was more concerned with social order. And so by 1890, membership was down to 100,000, and the Knights of Labor died soon after. Its attempt to be big, to some degree, did it in. And it would be superseded by a much more successful union we'll talk about next time.